are connected, that are present and connected virtually. A special greetings to Gloria de la Fuente, Under Secretary of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Chile. Thank you very much for being with us. Dear authorities of the government of Chile, dear members of the diplomatic corps, colleagues of the United Nations system and ECLAC, ladies and gentlemen present and virtually connected. It is a great joy for me and honor to be with you to resume one of the best traditions of this institution, the Raúl Prebisch Chair, this time in its 17th edition. This chair had its first version more than 2 decades ago, thanks to the happy initiative of the then Executive Secretary José Antonio Campo, as a way of paying tribute to Raúl Prebisch on the centennial of his birth. In August 2001, the Commission had, as first lecturer of the new chair, the well-remembered Brazilian economist Celso Furtado, who worked at this institution in the beginning and who, together with Raúl Prebisch, was one of those responsible for giving me vision and direction to this institution as a center of thought and promoter of economic development in our region. Since that first conference, in addition to Celso Furtado, figures of enormous intellectual history, such as Joseph Stiglitz, Fernando Enrique Cardoso, Rubens Recupero, Danny Woodrick, Enrique Iglesias, Tulio Halperin, Fernando Sabater, Aldo Ferrer, José Antonio Campo, Danilo Astori, Luis Gonzaga de Melo Beluso, Rolando Cordera, Mariana Mazzucato, Ricardo French Davis, and Ha-Yun Chang have taught at this chair. All these speakers who provided ECLAC and the region with their light and knowledge addressed issues of transcendental importance for the world and for Latin America and the Caribbean. Presentations were made on different development models, innovation, productivity, multilateralism, social inequality policies, and the new realities of the international economy, just to mention a few of the topics. In these lectures, the constant tone has been to recapitulate where we come from, where we are, and above all, where we are heading, or rather where we should or could be heading in light of the changing global and regional realities. They have been chairs that in various ways have shown us the North, how to navigate the complexities of the world. So this space for reflection and analysis has always been focused on the future, on how to build a better future for all people, not only the memory of the past or the mere contemplation of the present. Today, we resume this chair after 4 years. The last time was in 2019. How the world and the region have changed since then. We have suffered the dreadful pandemic of COVID-19 with its enormous and devastating economic and social consequences. The technological and digital revolution has accelerated, but also has the technological rivalry between the major powers. We have had a crisis and global supply chains. We have moved into a new era of high inflation and high interest rates and the cost of credit. And just when we had been consigned to history, the war of Ukraine exploded, and now another one in the Middle East, with potential devastating consequences and risks, both generating not only enormous human suffering, but also extremely high uncertainty for the world economy, acceleration of the already tense geopolitical relations, and serious weakening and even greater risk for the multilateral system and international cooperation. And to this, we must add already the impacts of climate change and the existential threat that climate change represents for the planet and humanity, as well as the sharp increase in migratory flows. All this has delayed and complicated progress on the international development agenda, in particular, progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals and 2030 Agenda. We are halfway to 2030, but we have not even reached halfway of the road. In this context of profound challenges, threats to human progress, in the face of this radical change in the realities and perceptions of the advantages and risks of interdependence and globalization, in the face of new threats to multilateralism as well as to democratic systems, resuming the Raúl Prebisch chair after 4 long years was indispensable. And today we are resuming this chair with a person who has studied human development in depth, who has dedicated her life to the fight against poverty and to generating greater conditions for development with equity, who has a broad vision of the world and of the region with an extraordinary capacity for negotiation and dialogue in regional multilateral spaces, and who, in addition, has always had a special sensitivity for people who find themselves in vulnerability and injustice.
That has moved to many other positions in which has left an important path. I am really pleased to welcome and to introduce not only the economist, but my compatriot, my dear friend and companion of many battles in time, the Secretary General of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, Mrs. Rebeca Grynspan. Welcome, Rebeca, and thank you very much for accepting this invitation. Rebeca is one of those exceptional leaders that are rare in each generation, maybe since she went to University of Costa Rica, where she was starting to study economics. She also took her first political steps along with a group of colleagues who, besides flying the flags of social justice, embraced with dedication the study and serious and informed reflection on the challenges of public policy. From those early years, Rebeca shone on her own merits and her extraordinary professional skills and human qualities. Oscar Arias, the president of Costa Rica, called her to serve as vice minister of finance in his first administration in 1986. At the end of the turbulent decade of the 80s and beginning of the 90s, Rebeca Grynspan was already a benchmark in politics and economics in Costa Rica. The candidate to the presidency of the Republic, José María Figueres, asked her to join him on the ticket as his vice president, winning the election in 1994. In her role as Vice President of the Republic from 1994 to 1998, she was appointed by President Figueres as coordinator of both the economic and social sectors of the government. She was also appointed Minister of Housing and Human Settlements. And I should boast, I guess, that during those years, I was her cabinet colleague when I had the honor of being Minister of Foreign Trade in that administration. Her achievements and experience in her career in politics and national public policy led her to transcend the borders of her homeland, and the region was initially the main beneficiary. Because since 2001 until 2006, she directed the ECLAC sub-regional headquarters for Mexico and Central America. As of 2006, she was appointed regional director for Latin America and the Caribbean of the United Nations Development Program. She held this position for 4 years, since in 2010, the then Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, appointed her as Undersecretary General and Associate Administrator of UNDP. 4 years later, in 2014, the governments of Spain and Costa Rica proposed Rebeca's candidacy to head the Ibero-American General Secretariat and replace her beloved Enrique Iglesias, who was Executive Secretary of this commission and who by 2014 was closing almost a decade at the head of SEGIB. While at the head of SEGIB, and after almost 8 years of extraordinary work as the first woman to use that position, the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, proposed Rebeca to take on the General Secretariat of UNCTAD. which was confirmed by the General Assembly. Once again, she becomes the first woman to hold this position. Rebeca's leadership has been successfully tested in each of the positions she has held, and now at UNCTAD, known as with the promotion of policies that will enable the developing countries to recover from the aftermath of COVID and the cascade of shocks that they have received in the midst of the geopolitical conflicts that afflict us so much. Furthermore, in recognition of her experience and skills, Secretary General Guterres put her in charge of the Global Food, Energy, and Finance Crisis Response Group, as well as uh, in charge of negotiation functions and facilitation functions related to the supply and transport of cereals across the Black Sea. She has been involved in all types of committees and organizations that have human development as their ultimate goal. For her roles. She was extensive recognition in 2014 and 15. She was chosen as one of the 50 most influential intellectuals in Latin America from 17 to 20. Forbes magazine highlighted her as one of the 100 most influential women in Central America, awarding her the Forbes Award for Excellence in 2017. In 2020, she received a recognition of two awards, the Gumercindo de Azcárate Award and the Woman of the Year Award from the Women in a Legal World Association. In 2019, the government of Spain honored her with the highest civilian distinction by awarding her the Gran Cruz de la Orden Civil de Alfonso X el Sabio. In 2020, she was awarded the Aquí Europa Vocento Award for her outstanding work as the Latin American personality, contributing significantly to the strengthening of relations between the European Union and Latin America. And in 2021, the President of Portugal recognized her merits by awarding her the Grand Cross of the Order of Infante Don Enrique. In addition, she holds honorary doctorates from the University of Salamanca, University of Extremadura, and the European University of Madrid. Undoubtedly, because of her knowledge and expertise, Rebeca is the ideal individual to deliver today's lecture, which she has entitled Globalization Disrupted, Globalization Prebisch, Trade Imbalances and the Future of the International Economy. It is a pleasure to invite Rebeca Grynspan to deliver her Prebisch 2023 lecture. It seems there's a difference in height over here, for which you are already prepared. Well, thank you, dear José Manuel Salazar, Secretary, and dear friend and companion, as he said, of so many battles we've shared. Many thanks for the very generous and moving remarks. It is an honor to be here after this introduction. You feel like you need to run and you just be left with that impression, I guess. Dear colleagues at ECLAC, for so many years, such good friends. I'm so happy to see many friends sitting here from the United Nations system, and dear ambassadors, Vice Minister, thank you so much for being here with us. Dear friends, all of you, thank you so much for being here. In fact, we need to start by saying I'm an ECLAC person, and those 4 years at ECLAC, heading the Mexico office, was only one of the elements that made me an ECLAC individual throughout my entire career in my intellectual life, because as I wrote in the ECLAC book, my intellectual path, it's a path together with ECLAC. In fact, wholeheartedly, I'd like to express the honor what it is to be here as economist, as Secretary General of UNCTAD, but most of all as an ECLAC member. Being here is being at home. As you know, UNCTAD and ECLAC are sister organizations because they come from the same father, Raúl Prebisch, the first General Secretary of both institutions. I think it's not by luck that starting at ECLAC, I ended up being the Secretary General of UNCTAD, because one of the things that ECLAC leaves you and to all economists that go through it or that have lived off of it, is a permanent dosage of heterodoxy. Heterodoxy that personally has been a vaccination method in the face of many excesses of public policy, so marked by the Washington consensus that look out for economic models at the time, uh, or the messianism of the market. But what's true is that, as Edith Hamilton said, the heterodoxy of a generation is the orthodoxy of the next one. Now, the reductionism of the Washington consensus has been recognized finally since the world experienced the crisis in 2008 and the huge challenges that we went through COVID and the pandemic. Finally, we see the return of industrial policy in Western world. Heterodoxy is once again and a fad. And this is a call to UNCTAD and ECLAC, and of course to Raúl Prebisch himself. ECLAC is celebrating 75 years this 2023, and UNCTAD will celebrate 60 years next year. It is the right time to reflect on the questions that are still open for us. Having said that, that is the purpose of this talk, to talk about this generational change in the economic thinking that responds to a tectonic change in the field of globalization, and that I describe as a step between a hyperglobalization period to a period that I call of polyglobalization. My talk will be broken down into three segments. First, I will talk about the hyperglobalization. I will share then with you some ideas about this period of possible polyglobalization that is emerging. And I will close with some thoughts about a legacy of Mr. Prebisch in the context of the work that ECLAC and UNCTAD and the United Nations have been called to play in this context of this new paradigm. Before starting, though, I believe it is important to reflect on something that the secretary mentioned. Outside, millions of people are suffering. The economic crisis, cascading economic crisis, as we have called them in the United Nations, COVID-19, the the climate disasters, war, geopolitics, and the unbearable burden of the debt are causing issues in the context of our global study. The common agendas that we developed together in 2015, being convinced that our fate of our humanity are together are in danger. At this pace, only 15% of the Sustainable Development Goals will be achieved by 2030. We have seen regressions in the poverty figures, and hunger indicators, and gender equality, just to mention a few. Foreign direct investment, which was a driver of development, has been stagnant since the crisis of 2008 in most of the countries. We have a $4 billion gap, billion in Spanish, trillion in English, to fund SDGs in the global south. A gap that has only been growing because the estimate of what was the financing gap for SDGs in 2015 was 2.5 billion, and now we are at 4 trillion. At the same time, 3.3 billion people, 3.3 billion people, 3.3 billion inhabitants are living in countries that right now focus more resources on serving the debt than financing healthcare or education. So half of humankind is in that condition. We are therefore in a paradigm in which SDGs and the Paris agreements are very difficult to achieve. And this is terribly dangerous because I will not tire of saying that SDGs, I'm sorry, I'm saying it in English, are too big to fail. SDGs are much more than a set of objectives, are our common agenda in a more politicized world than ever, a world that needs desperately needs solidarity and multilateralism. Um, the sentiment that we feel around us is a reminder of what is at stake when we lose sight of the long term, when we leave people behind, when we lose the capability of being in someone else's shoes. What we see is a warning of what the world could be by 2030 if the SDGs fail. That is why this discussion today is about changing the model of globalization, and it's not necessarily a mere academic exercise. It's it's hope and vision to try to see ways in which we can work to build a different paradigm before it's too late. Now, with this preamble, let's look at what happens in this transition from hyper-globalization to what I call poly-globalization. Let me start but from the top. But there's no consensus regarding when it started or when hyperglobalization ended. However, there's no doubt that the zenith of this period are the 2 decades between 1990 until 2010. In these 20 years, we have the three major factors that marked this period in macroeconomic terms. There was a huge foreign investment growth that was multiplied by 7 globally in this period. And we have growth of foreign trade that multiplied by 4 in those 20 years.
And we have the growth of the use of IT technology, communication with levels of access to internet going from 1% to 30% of world population in that period of time. Much higher is in these years, of course. Now, this was for Latin America the first decade and a half of this century, the time for great growth with reductions in poverty, inequality, thanks to the tailwinds of the super cycle of raw materials and thanks to a major effort of public policies. On the other hand, there are those who say that hyperglobalization did not end in 2010 with the financial crisis, but rather in 2016 with Brexit and Trump, or even in 2020 with the pandemic. I agree with those that place the date later, but what is clear is that from 1980 to 2020, we see a bell with 2 tails, but the center is between the 90s and 2010, in the center of the bell. Now, what happened in these years? Indeed, there was enormous growth and a reduction of global poverty, particularly in China, as we know. Between 1990 and 2010, the extreme poverty in the world went down to half, with almost 800 million people that left extreme poverty. 440 million of those 800 million are those that leave poverty behind in China. So half of that success was specifically for China. And so that is why, if you recall, the Millennium Development Goals was met 5 years prior than that expected. And there was a convergence between the global south and the global north. But underneath the surface, there are negative factors that grew during that same period of time. And I refer to, first, inequality. This is a topic for ECLAC, especially inequality inside the countries, in spite of the convergence in the GDP, the per capita income rate between in the south and the north. According to UNCTAD, the top or richest 1% of the world received 75% of the production of the wealth of the decade of 2010. Secondly, was what some call the premature disindustrialization in many countries. According to data of Roderick's study of 2015, Brazil reached its peak in terms of employment in the manufacturing sector in 1986. India in 2002, Mexico in the 80s, Indonesia in 2001. After that, employment in the manufacturing sector in all those countries went down. And we can continue in Ghana, it was in 78, in Nigeria in 82. The index of productive capacity of UNCTAD shows the same globally and shows the stagnation of 20 years in manufacturing employment in the world and the increase of countries raw material dependent. We would have thought that those countries depending on raw materials was going to go down. However, currently 76% of all countries of least developed countries depend on commodities. That is, more than 60% of their revenue comes from raw materials. 15 years ago, there were 15 countries less dependent on commodities. So the number of commodity dependence or raw material dependence has gone up. It hasn't gone down. The disindustrialization has been a particularly harmful phenomenon because, as Prebisch did say, there's no development without industry. And we speak of industry in the broadest sense. We emphasize this, and ECLAC has also emphasized it, that we are, of course, speaking about complex sectors with high added value. It's not only industry, because digital economy, robotization of 4.0 industry cannot be reduced only to the industrial or merely manufacturing sector, but we speak about industrial policy in this broadest sense, or active productive policies or productive diversification. And the difference is quite clear in this aspect, with the exception of some commodity-rich countries, especially in the Arab Gulf. There hasn't been any country of the world that has skipped the trap of middle-income countries without a manufacturing robust sector. Now, one of the consequences of this premature disindustrialization was the growth of dual economies or productive heterogeneity that UNCTAD and ECLAC have worked on, and that describe most and characterize most of middle-income countries in the world. A strong exporting sector paying good salaries on one side, then another local economy marked by informality, unemployment, and low added value. Inequality, generator of inequality. And as the ECLAC and UNDP studied in this period of time, in the second sector of services of economy, from where the vulnerable middle classes emerged and then dropped in poverty once again with COVID. And this leads us to the third negative factor, the lack of resilience in the international sector. It was fine, hyperglobalization, while the boom of raw materials flourished that ended in 2015. Once the boom came to an end, inequalities emerged again. Latin America is, as ECLAC says, in another lost decade. And COVID, when the region lost decades of social progress in only a few months, and that showed that we were calling development something that was not development and didn't deserve the totality of that word, because the per capita rate index hid more than what it showed. And therefore, we have this new policy for new measurement of what is called beyond GDP that has been proposed in a paper that was distributed to all the members of UN system for its discussion in the future summit next year. This lack of resilience is the result of several things. One is the lack of diversified economic structures in developing countries, as we know. Another thing was the commercial dynamics that some call winner-takes-all trade, the concentration of value chains only in a few industrial focus with greater productivity. In Asia, a great concentration of value chains in very few countries, and also a major concentration in the market power of only a few economic players. We have just published in UNCTAD an analysis of the food market in order to give an example, and Mario, highly related to our dialogue with FAO, 4 companies control 70% of the food market in the world. 70%, and that we see it in energy, pharmaceuticals, and we see that in the digital world, to which I will refer further ahead. So it's not only a geographic concentration, but also a concentration of monopoly, oligopoly powers in the main international trade products. The third point, from my point of view, is a decisive factor. Less is spoken about, and that is the weakening of public capacities, both at national and international levels. Especially, I will refer to the weakening of the financial system for development. Hyperglobalization not only involved a withdrawal of the state from public policy matters, also involved a withdrawal of the financial development system of Bretton Woods. The two data, which is evidence of that, in that the financial or our international financial architecture has become too small to assume the challenges we have today internationally, is that today the World Bank is 1/5 regarding the world economy as what it was in the 60s, 1/5 of what it was. And as to the international IMF, the data I would like to convey is that the liquidity that the IMF made available to all the developing countries in 1 year is what Fed can print in quantitative easing in 1 month, only for the United States. And this is the balance in terms of the capacity of the international financial system to respond, in order to respond at the necessary scale to all the challenges we face today. And that without taking into account the problem of the business model, to call it some way, of the World Bank and IMF that need to change. You've seen how G20 in a document, a discussion paper on development banks, has proposed several measures in order to improve the model and the scale of the World Bank, but also regarding the International Monetary Fund. And especially with the IMF, also the issue that the IMF has a business model of country by country, for a country not to produce contagion to the rest of the economies or rest of the countries of the region, has one model to decide how to act, which is individual. It addresses country by country. But what we've seen in recent years is systemic shocks. The instrument of country by country and program by program does not respond to a reality where we have the systemic shock of climate change, or the systemic shock of the pandemic, or the systemic shock of the Ukrainian war, and now the war in the Middle East. And precisely the problem of that is exacerbated because in the international financial system, neither is there a multilateral system of debt restructuring. We have here in this room the experts on this subject, and Stephanie has written a lot about this subject for many years. But today, this is more critical. It's much more evident precisely for what we are facing now. And this change in the international financial system is needed urgently today. We've made a few things from the UN system. Yes, also a policy document was distributed in order to be intergovernmentally discussed, in order to have this in the future summit of next year, and ECLAC, UNCTAD, and the other regional commissions prepared a whole document on the debt subject, where precisely we highlighted this issue and where ECLAC and UNCTAD propose that not only do we believe that there is a debt crisis, and if you see the documents of G20 or G7 or IMF and World Bank now in Marrakesh, do not speak about a debt crisis, don't want to speak about the debt crisis, because markets are not in crisis. Who is in crisis is people, but markets are not, because the countries that have a debt crisis today do not move the markets. And that is why we don't speak urgently about a debt crisis. But what we say is that however you want to call the problem of debt, what's true is that there is a development crisis. Impossible.
Because countries are facing impossible decisions if we spend more in servicing the debt, more than in education and healthcare. Well, we are incapable of reinvesting on development for the future. And this is coupled with lack of investment of multilateral banking system. The lack of private investment and the cost increase in cost of capital increase. And I'd like to, I will not delve into this because I don't have the time, but 2024 possibly will be the fourth consecutive year in which we are going to see less growth in the coming year compared to the previous year globally. And at the same time, this is the outcome of the significant weakness in investment that was never recovered after 2008 globally, and of the significant weakness in terms of international trade. So we have a global financing issue, developing countries. We have a world economy that is growing at a limited rate, but also investment and trade that have been two of the elements, significant elements for our countries with significant weaknesses from which they have not recovered since the 2008 crisis. And this has meant that crisis after crisis, countries can only resort to more and more expensive debt. And now debt is using more and more space of our fiscal expenses, which means less social investment, less investment on infrastructure, and less investment on sustainable development. If you look at the document that we published with the regional commissions, in Latin America, still debt servicing is not more than investment on healthcare and education, but it is higher than investment, than actual investment, infrastructure, or overall investment in our country. This is the largest sub-investment continent, to put it in a certain way. Everything that I'm describing now regarding inequality, deindustrialization, weakness had significant impacts, political first and then geopolitical in the world. This talk is not the right time to address this problem, but it's been quite studied that those that voted for Trump and for Brexit were those that suffered deindustrialization the most from the offshoring wave of the 90s and 2000s. So, on the other hand, as Antonio Guterres, our Secretary General, says with the unfulfilled promises of climatic financing, the lack of solidarity of vaccination measures during COVID, and the increased investment gaps, the global South countries have felt acutely deserted, and that meant that they have adopted a much more skeptical geopolitical position. On the other hand, the new generations, in the face of increasing inequality and the significant lack of climate action during the hyperglobalization period, have been disillusioned. And finally, the increased trade tensions have caused a paralysis of the multilateral system, especially in the commercial areas, with the World Trade Organization without an appeals institution since the end of 2019, a problem that doesn't seem to be solved in the coming uh, WTO ministerial meeting. Jake Sullivan, the Security Council of President Biden, uh, reflects the spirit of the times. I asked my friends, and how do you pronounce that in German? Because it's a German expression, which is Zeitgeist. Zeitgeist. Is that right, Anna? When this April, he made a presentation. Sullivan presented at the Brookings Institute about the new industrial policy in the U.S. Started the following way. I'd like to thank the indulgence of receiving a national security counselor to talk about economics. In that speech, Sullivan said the premise that trade-based commerce would be inclusive and that its benefits will be broadly shared by all nations was a wrong premise. That is to say, the United States uh, has actually withdrawn its wager on trade. There's no consensus about the date for the end of hyperglobalization. This Sullivan speech is a good candidate, I guess, in order to set a date, because this is the first time that a public policy leader openly expresses the main difference between the old globalization and the new globalization. That is to say, the subordination of trade to geopolitical interests instead of merely economic interests. That's the difference also between the North and the South. In the North, uh, the submission of growth and economic interests to security and geopolitical interests is so clear, whereas in the South, the issue of sustainable growth and the low growth in our countries is still uh, the main issue. And here, once again, we see a gap in terms of this world. However, the question now is what will happen in this period? And with that, I'm going to tell you why I believe, um, in the best of cases, I should say, what we're going to see is a potential holy globalization. And the reality is that uh, we are in a transition period, and the problem with transitions is that it's easy to get lost in them. And here we all remember Gramsci. We have the problem that whatever it's dying doesn't complete its dying, and what's being born doesn't complete that period. And that's when ghosts arise. The road seems to be at a crossroads. On the one hand, the total disconnect, the total commercial disconnect, especially with China, and the IMF estimates that a decoupling would mean a drop in global GDP of 5%. That is to say, two COVID pandemics. And on the other hand, we have strategies that talk about not of the decoupling, but of the risking with diversification of value chains in the search for improving the excesses of hyperglobalization and looking for new commercial partners, shorter value chains for the benefit of diversifying suppliers and markets. That's when we see the nearshoring and the reshoring that have benefited so importantly countries in Latin America, and especially Mexico. And why? do we look for this? Just remember, and this is just an indicator, that 85% of the refining of batteries and 55% of lithium processing and cobalt processing is in China. And this was one of the major disruptions we saw in COVID-19 that we didn't hear much about. It was the disruption of value chains of sustainable energies. Um, why? Because of disruption and the lockdown in China, those value chains are very weakened. Also, in this de-risking, we have regionalisms again, and the most important one is the free trade zone in Africa, the continental Africa free trade zone. Unfortunately, the example is not Latin America. I wish it were. And once again, we resume protectionism limited to certain sectors. So what is called high, high fence, small yard, high protectionism, but in very well-defined small sectors. Is not an overall protectionism necessarily. And this is precisely what Sullivan says in his speech. It is clear that we are in a context in which the pendulum is going the other direction, and we are definitely facing a different type of globalization. And debate is also whether, besides being different, is lower. There are elements to think about that there may be some de-globalization because international trade is growing much less than the global economy, only 1%. And there's a de-acceleration of the trade since 2008. But it is important to say that although there are drops in goods trade, but the service trade has shown much more resilience. And digital trade is still growing uh, with certain dynamism. And that's why some say that what's happening now, reality, first of all, we are poorly measuring service trade or digital trade, which is a problem for indicators and numbers. And those of you who are experts will know better than I do. However, some talk about the dematerialization of international trade, which is much less focused on goods, or even in terms of the goods value. The digital or the service part is much larger compared to the material goods that are sold. I see three major factors. First, we are facing a more decentralized globalization. That's why I talk about poly-globalization. We're going from a system dominated by a few global powers to a network of regional poles, large continental southern economies, what they call the continent countries, and the boom of different plurinational fora. This means that there's more policy done at G7, G20, and BRICS than in multilateral fora. This means that there's less agreements going through World Trade Organization, but there are more regional agreements, either the African Treaty, the AFTA, or the new Trans-Pacific agreements, or the Mercosur efforts. This means that the World Bank has lost weight or importance, but the regional banks such as CAF, African Development Bank, the NDB or BRICS, are looking to repopulate those empty spaces. We are facing, as I will say, to a competitive multilateralism, not universal though. The second factor that comes or stems from the previous one is the multipoles and the geo-economy that I referred to at the beginning of this millennium. We said we'd wonder whether multipolarity will make us more multilateral or not. So the question is still open. The signs that we see are not very promising, but it's clear that there are important political poles arising in Asia, Africa, Europe, and the Arab world, and to a lesser extent in Latin America. For the time being, however, geopolitics in multipolarity is leaving us without free space. What do I mean? The United Nations for years has tried for humanitarian issues not to rely on geopolitical or political interests or international cooperation, for example. We want humanitarian measures should depend on that. The same thing applies to cooperation. In in multilateralism, there should be independent space, but it seems today that everything is covered by geopolitics, that there's no space. Technology, international affairs, humanitarian aspects, commerce and trade are subject to geopolitics. And among these blocks, we do not only see economic competition and military competition, but we also see a different vision of the world. This is yet another aspect of this multipolarity, which is quite relevant for ethical discussion. The end of a single political development model, the end of that idea of the end of history, that liberal democracy was the logical continuation of the market economy. And as I've been saying for a few years already, that does better to market than to democracy. There are those who describe this change as a dichotomy that we've also heard between democracies and autocracy. I believe it is a simplistic reading. It is not about bifurcation, but fragmentation. And even in the face of democracy in the context of polarization, we are seeing a fragmentation of important values. And this, in turn, is leading to a volatility of international alliances that is so significant as well to highlight. However, the commercial consequence of the shock among Poles is what friend shoring, the intention of taking value chains to allied countries or friendly countries. It is yet to be seen how much of this will be materialized, because many countries of the global south are not interested in this new way of seeing things. When choosing a pole, many countries, what they are trying to find, after all, as I said, after so many unfulfilled promises and results, and this is something, this is precisely what I said before, that we call the competitive multilateralism, the possibility for competition among these poles, or to be one to see who provides the better results. And this is something that, to a large extent, we are experiencing already with the in China, the global gateway, in Europe, the Build Back Better world of Biden, etc.
Claro que el multilateralismo, of course, competitive multilateralism, only globalization, one could say that's the good side to think about this, that finally there may be competition, reasonable competition, or multipolarity that works. We all know that there is an alternative scenario that's Manichaeism, that is the good against the bad against the good, that feeds racism, penalizes those who are different. And the third factor is the return of the industrial policy, which is what connects us to Prebisch. In that speech of Sullivan, he was trying to defend the two industrial policies of Biden, CHIPS Act and Inflation Reduction Act. We know that it is to promote renewable energies based on very generous subsidies. And that has given rise to some enthusiasm among those who promote sustainability and energy transition. But at the same time, complaints here from countries in Europe. And the CHIPS Act is a program of industrial policy, but more protectionist, based on sanctions to the semiconductor sectors of some countries, especially addressed to China. These policies are reflections of similar programs in the rest of the world. Europe has the next generation funds. China, Korea, and Japan never left back the industrial policies and have doubled their promotion, especially in renewable energies and semiconductors. In Africa, the idea is to reindustrialize the continent. Indonesia, to promote diversification based on its raw materials, enacted in 2019 a law against gross nickel a raw nickel export. That is a law that is discussed among those countries who are lithium rich. And in Latin America, Argentina, Peru, Bolivia, the idea is to promote a national industry of lithium. So it's important to highlight a bit, ironically, that much of this would not be possible if WTO had an appeals body in operation. Indonesia was taken to dispute settlement of WTO because of the nickel. And apparently it is working. It is working now. It was taken to WTO, lost on the first stage, and Indonesia appealed. As there is no appeal organ, nothing else happens. And that is what happens in many of the subjects where what there is unilateral decisions and not multilateral decisions regarding trade. In this item, then, we need to say that we have a crisis in the world of rules of trade because the world doesn't have a trade commercial structure adapted to a context where all peoples are conducting industrial policy. And this, in the long run, can be a danger for small countries that depend on an international rules-based trade. It's difficult to think that Costa Rica or Chile will have a successful strategy where the major poles or major industrial powers are fighting a subsidy war. I mean, we don't have neither the fiscal space nor the possibility to defend ourselves without rules, only based on our trade power. And if we believe that industrial policy that can be very positive nationally and internationally, only if that were based in multilateral agreements, because in national level, there's a potential to reduce the economic gaps to reverse and promote productive transformation of the countries of the South. I give us some figures in Africa that evidence what could be done if they had a policy of productive diversification. Africa has, for example, 48% of cobalt and manganese reserves, 48% of the reserves of the world, 80% of rock phosphate, and 92% of reserves in the world of platinum. The energy transition cannot be done without Africa. And this is a major opportunity for Africa for its diversification. And this was precisely the premise of GATT, which was one of the legacies of Prebisch thinking. It's good that we have a different trade more favorable to productive transformation of the countries of the South, more energy-oriented, but let us not waste. This needs to be done multilaterally, negotiated with dialogue and something. If there is a polarizing geopolitics, we don't know what is the next world. Maybe it's worse for all. Another important subject is what will happen with digitalization. In fact, the main transformation of value chains of recent years is the intangibility of value chains. The trade of goods in terms of volumes dropped, not only in terms of prices, but also volumes. So digitalization has become the dynamic driver. And especially in services, what grows the most is the exchange of intellectual property, especially data interchange. All this led by the growth of digital economy. Now we know that our system, our trade system already had a regulatory vacuum in the digital area. Now the question, how will this impact on the industrial policy? India has proven that you can do industrial policy for a development digitalization driven. But it's important to say here that there have been problems generated there, especially in AI. I will not get into the artificial intelligence subject, because it is a long topic. But just to mention that part of the problem, or I mean, fake news is nothing. Now it's fake videos, fake voices, fake photos that are exact copies of reality. And so what are we facing? The question is, how do we know the truth? How can we find the truth? How do we know what's true and what's false? And this in a time where information is abundant, but the truth is scarce. We've seen the consequences of disinformation campaigns in democratic processes, in wars, in conflicts, in public health. And we know that the response to these questions, precisely, this is very important part of the discussion, the response is not technological, it's ethical. When we lose that perspective, nothing can take us to a better place. Now, the father of AI in Google clearly said in an interview, in an article written shortly ago, that there is no way to regulate AI after the intelligence AI processes take place. It has to be before. You need to invest a lot of resources in order to imbue the AI with ethical parameters when it is being developed. Afterwards, regulation comes too late, too late. And this discussion is going to be one in the next ministerial conference on trade because of the moratorium and all the discussions on digital issues. Now, I go very fast to the last topic, which is Prebisch's legacy and the UN role. Here, I would like perhaps see some of the things in which Prebisch was completely right. The first one was the subject of the industrial policy, and it's true that the only countries that were successful were those who implemented good productive diversification strategies and industrial strategies. South Korea is the paradigm. It is a country that not many articles say it, but followed Prebisch. South Korea followed his ideas and succeeded. It's important to say, however, that Korea was the example of an industrialization focused on trade. It was an industrial policy with an openness, not of closing of markets, facing international trade, not giving them back to international trade. South Korea and China also showed that an industrial, well-conceived policy is a trial and error effort. It's a willingness to innovate with different methods. Asia didn't generate a model on the blackboard and see if it worked or not. Began in situ, in field, what really worked, and that was replicated. Therefore, a good policy to have an industrial policy, a strategic, innovative one, especially you have produced in ECLAC the best documents, and Mariana Mazzucato was the 2019? Yes? Was that the last Prebisch? Yes? 2017? That when I saw your list of those who had been in the Prebisch chair, she was the first woman, I'm the second one. Of all those who have something that you will need to have 10 more chairs with women. Now, there is a lot of literature in recent years about the subject of how to avoid market capturing. That is what we saw in Latin America. And here it is worthwhile to learn from Korea as well, but also from Peter Evans, mainly, who speaks about embedded autonomy, a system where the private and public sectors work very closely together, but each one with autonomy. The classification he makes, it's worthwhile revisiting it on these times of new industrial policies where we don't want to make the same mistakes than in the past. And he says that when you have a private sector and a public sector where one has low autonomy and low relations with the public or private sector, and there is what he calls the predatory state, and then speaks about the one with low autonomy, but very good integration of relations with the private sector, where the low autonomy is that of the public sector. And there you have the clientelar or interest captured state. And when you have autonomy of the government, but low articulation of relations with the private sector, and there you have the regulatory state, and there Europe is an example of that relation. And of course, Korea, the one that has both of them high autonomy of the public sector, so there's not capturing of the private sector by the private sector of the state, but there is a high relation of planning with the private sector, which is a state that is beneficial for development. And there's a new article this year about the new economy of the industrial policy that has an ontological track of in recent literature. I recommend reading Juhas Lane and Broad. Another aspect of Prebisch legacy is the subject of dependence on raw materials. We all know that very well. And the subject of center periphery.
What Prebisch did not foresee is that we should establish a different type of relationship between the periphery and the center, how it's happening in globalization today, because what we're seeing, it's a multiplicity of centers and peripheries. Countries such as India or China do not necessarily reproduce the characteristics of the historical center that Prebisch foresaw. But I remember in the document that we published about the emergence of the South when I was at UNDP. And one of the things that we used to say, and one of the different things in the world that is emerging, is that the second largest economy in the world, which will be the first largest economy in the world, will also be the most advanced and with significant elements of a developing economy, and that had never happened before in our recent economic history. Always the predominant economy was an economy that was at the same time the most advanced. However, today we have this combination that in turn means that the dynamic changes because multilateral negotiations at UN, at World Trade Organization shows a change in this trend because the new centers have a post-colonial hallmark, and its sympathies are in the global south. The role of India in joining in introducing the African Union G20 is a signal in that direction. However, undoubtedly, among the many centers, there will be periphery dynamics, and this is something that we are starting to see in economic data. In the latest document we published of trade and development this year, we talk about economic growth this year that has been marked by a double divergence. There's a divergence in the global north between Europe and the US, United States growing more than what we expected, and Europe, Germany already in a recession, and Europe with a growth that could be named as recessive as well. And also in the United States, with a soft landing that will survive. And a divergence in the global south, with BRICS growing quickly and the rest of the world in developing, especially the border economies, the ones that are between the less advanced and the emerging countries, such as Vietnam, Senegal, or Ghana, that are the ones that are suffering the international crisis the most. BRICS in general, with the exception of South Africa, are faring quite well. Their economies are faring quite well, and this is also due to the fact that uh, the international financial support network did develop important instruments to support emerging countries, precisely in order not to cause a problem in the debt markets. So these are countries that have swaps with the Federal Reserves or with the Central European Bank, and therefore they do not have liquidity problems. And they do not have a debt problem compared to what happens to many of the countries, the ones that we call border countries, because we do not have an international support system or financial support system that is universal. And the other aspect that should be mentioned, I believe, is we should reflect regarding what Prebisch position is the terms of exchange of the Prebisch-Singer hypothesis. I'm not going to dwell on that, but we should think about this, thinking of digital economy and data economy, because data uh, it's a raw matter that we give away. It's like giving away oil and buying gasoline. This is what we are doing with the digital economy. And the concentration, and this is an UNCTAD report that I recommend. I will only give you some data about concentration in digital economy. When when we break down the value chain, and there are only two countries that account for this, which is China and the US, not even Europe, that account for half of all the data centers. Hyperscale data centers are located in China and the US. 94% of all the startups, 70% of all artificial intelligence researchers, and 90% of the capitalization of the main digital platforms that are Amazon, Alphabet, Google, Alibaba, and Tencent, and they dominate the entire market, digital market. And that's why some of us say, how can we survive? How will democracy survive with this level of concentration? I told you the concentration in food. This is the concentration on data. We see the same in energy, although there is an opportunity with renewable energies, and we have the same drama with healthcare and pharmaceutical companies, as it was demonstrated during the pandemic. An important omission by Prebisch that should be mentioned is that there was no gender in his analysis. ECLAC has done a huge contribution to this and has shown and demonstrated how trade deprived of a gender approach may accentuate inequalities in the labor market, in production concentration, and low added value sectors, the unfair distribution of the care work, and the pay gap for women. It can also leave women outside international trade, because at the same time, countries that depend on raw materials do not create jobs for women. So all of this topic was fully absent during Prebisch's tenure, and that is a contribution that ECLAC has made, and that other economists, gender economists, have included lately, and maybe it would be worthwhile. And this is something that I thank Ana Guesmes, because she mentioned this to me, which is the there are important initiatives to analyze the differentiated impact of international trade on women. In the 11th Ministerial Conference of World Trade Organization, the joint declaration regarding trade and economic empowerment of women was underwritten by 117 countries in 2017. Chile did something with Uruguay in 2016. These are the most important forerunners, if you wish. But this declaration has increased in support from the countries in the European Parliament, regionally as well, and it's become a very important topic that we should all consider in our analysis into the future. And more, we see these clauses in the gender provisions in commercial regional agreements as the years have gone by. The main ones in this topic have been the European Union, Chile, and Canada. So there's a lot to thank Chile in that regard. So I'm about to close with the last thought about Prebisch, which is that one of the most important things by Prebisch was this call to multilateral cooperation, this call to multilateralism. And it meant now in this poly-globalization, this is what should mean, is to give a voice to countries that historically have been marginalized in the decision-making process globally. Our institutions in longevity have done a lot to achieve this, to close this gap, and to provide fair solutions to all countries. But our biggest task is just starting. I'd like to highlight that we should provide order to chaos. So we are institutions that should keep working as such. Our conferences shouldn't lose space. That we do not lose the trust of people. This is something that is more and more difficult in poly-globalization. Some polls will want you to say certain things, and others will want you to be silent. Keeping equality, transparency, and trust is a growing challenge, but it's more and more important as well. Another important thing in this context is mitigating collateral damage of disruption of value chains. It's something that UNCTAD and ECLAC has been working on specifically. And here I'd like to mention something that José Manuel mentioned, which is or United Nations action in disruption of the trade of grains in the Black Sea, which the two initiatives signed in Istanbul, the initiative of the Black Sea grains and the MOU with the Russian Federation were a very important contribution in this direction. And the last important task is to research emerging phenomena. There are so many things happening in the world, and we are called to be ahead. We are called to be ahead of that. When the war broke in Ukraine, we came up with a very quick analysis in just three weeks to discuss the effects of war on value chains, energy and food chains. And that meant a significant influence on how the war was being conceived, because at the time we only heard about the effect of the war on the countries surrounding Ukraine. Nobody was thinking of the impact it might have in the developing world, precisely because of the increase of food prices and energy prices that was creating significant problems in the cost of living crisis. So I believe we should believe um, in our institutions, UNCTAD and ECLAC in this case, but the rest of the United Nations system, because we have a capacity of having an influence. What we can do when we are diligent, when we are able to get ahead of our time, we may have an influence regarding the direction that we embark on. Let me close with this, and I'd like to, of course, close by saying that we are once again in a transition period, change of direction of the pendulum in the depth of globalization. The poly-globalization may be a convergence promise between diversity and unity, a path to a more uncertain future, but it could be more inclusive at the same time. But this transition is not deprived of risks. We are facing resistance of old structures, the inertia of obsolete practices, and what's critical, the actual risk of not understanding each other. We are witness of a very discouraging moment of the specter of a global war, and that we may fail in our 2030 agenda and the Paris Agreement. That's why I'd like to invite each and every one of you to be part of this discussion, to contribute from our own positions, to build bridges, to listen, to learn from the diversity that surrounds us. A poly-globalization with multilateralism is an invitation to expand the horizon, to practice empathy and collaboration. Is a more complex version, I guess, but it might be a richer version of the global village. And as I always say, in these complex times, only complexity can save us. Thank you very, very much.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Mrs. Greenspan, Secretary General of UNCTAD, for your conference. Next, and as we have our conference, and she will answer questions from the room and from those who are connected online. The Executive Secretary will chair this segment. Please scan the QR code on the screen, and through it, you'll be able to ask questions. Please state your name and then ask your question, Secretary. So thank you, Rebecca, because of this extraordinary conference. You have introduced the polyglobalization term with multilateralism, and I believe you have given us, well, and besides the fact that the latest Prebisch conference took place 4 years ago, or how the world has changed, that you have updated us, but listening to you, so much substance, of course, I believe also you have given us a whole agenda on research of a very fluent world filled with different trends. And I believe we have taken note and will take note to see, and it will be part of our collaboration with other regional conferences such as UNCTAD and the United Nations to deepen. I believe we need to update the concept, the way in which we perceive globalization.
Because as you say, it's tremendous complexity and it's moving complexity in complex manners. It's important to understand for the foreign policy of countries, for the economic policy, for strategies of international insertion. I would like to raise only one question. There are several. If you want to do it, you can do it through the platform. If you feel that the platform is limiting, we have a microphone, and we could, if you raise your hand and would like to ask a question here. But my question precisely is about the role that the United Nations has had through you, because you have been a key person in that, in these negotiations and facilitation with the Black Sea. It's something important and but not very well known. What has this been about? We know that apparently it's not that negotiations have been broken, but it's not a good time. And maybe give us a context. What are the implications for the future? It's a part of the cereals, grains, fertilizers as well, that will have a medium or long-term impact as the world, small landowners are not applying the amount of fertilizer needed, and therefore the activity and production will suffer in the medium and long term. Although you fix the problem now, which I don't think so, we will be accumulating a problem. Thank you for that question. I'll say everything I can say. Yes, I think it is a key topic. When the war begins in Ukraine, what we see in the rest of the world is an increase in food prices and energy prices combined together with major financial restrictions at the time, because it's also the time where, due to inflation internationally, but mainly in the US and Europe, interest rates start going up. And that is the highest rise ever aware of, the largest one we've ever seen, even faster and greater than the one we suffered in the 80s that really unleashed the debt crisis here in Latin America. So, several things happen. We at UNCTAD produced that rapid analysis, which was evident and captured attention, because you didn't have to read, you could only see the graphs of the importance of Ukraine and Russia in the international food trade, not only cereals, grains, corn, but also oil, and we tried to show what happened when Ukraine and Russia couldn't export in the amounts, the necessary amounts or previous amounts or to the rest of the world. And we saw which countries were impacted, what was happening with international trade at that point within that framework. I clearly recall, and this is something nobody knows, really, almost no one. There was a meeting of leader women of the UN convened by Amina Mohammed in Green Tree, precisely in those days that we were producing that rapid analysis. And this is 3 weeks after the war in Ukraine begins. And in that place, in Green Tree, there were many voices of women saying we are in a problem in the developing world. And everything we saw on the media is on migration and effects only in Europe. But we have a tremendous problem in the developing world as well. And that wasn't in the mindset in the international media or in the discussions that were occurring at that point. And it was there where Amina suggests to the Secretary General to set up this group for international crisis. After that discussion and after having read the analysis of what was happening in the whole world, in the developing world, and Secretary General decided to set up a crisis committee or group at 3 levels. One, heads of state and government, that in a conversation with him in order to be spokespersons and helping, influencing on the awareness of the problem we were going through. And the second level, chaired by Amina Mohammed, it was institutional, where the IMF, World Bank, developing regional banks were there, development banks, institutions of the UN. And a third level was one of more technical and analysis that should inform the other 2 levels, where working groups were set up on the subject of food and fertilizers, on energy and finance. And those 3 working groups have been coordinated by me and supported technically by UNCTAD and also by the regional commissions. We created working groups, and the regional groups were very much involved. FAO, for example, was very much involved in the area of food and fertilizers. And in energy, we had Energy for All, that was a group, and also the International Energy Organization. And truth is that those were the subjects, and in fact are the important ones insofar as in reporting for decision-making in these three aspects. And from there, you have three documents presented by the Secretary General internationally. The first one providing an overall view with emphasis on fertilizers and food. The second one on finances, and the third one on energy, where you had relevant information for these. That group is still active, and hopefully we'll be able to include this in normalcy of UN and not to keep an ad hoc group for a long time. As you know, in the UN, many temporal things become permanent, and that is not the best way to achieve consistency of the system. So I'm the coordinator of the three groups. I'm trying to have an exit strategy and not become a permanent structure that is really very pointless. However, what I can say, and now I refer to the Black Sea organization, is that I saw the UN system with its best phase in this case. It was true collaboration with the regional commissions. We did two things that were key. One was the vulnerability map of the country's vulnerability to the three impacts: financial, energy, and food and fertilizers. And the idea is not only the impact, which that was the first part of this endeavor, where all regional commissions participated in what was the impact in the regions. And with that, we had details and understanding of what was happening in each country, much greater than the general indicators that we can generate from UNCTAD. So in this vulnerability map, not only did we see the discussion of the impact, but also the capacity of countries to absorb, be a shock absorber, because the idea was to solve or manage the impact. So what was the vulnerability situation of countries in order to respond to a triple impact they were receiving? International prices of food increased 23% during that period of time. In a study of the World Bank, it was said that every 1% of increase in prices would involve 10 million people more below the poverty line. It is somewhat mechanical to say this like that, but that was more or less the range. In a very good study of the World Bank. And we were in a problem with 3 places in the world for the first time, with decades and ranges of famine in 6 places, something that we hadn't seen those that in decades. And so we were facing a true severe problem of food insecurity. And this accompanied by the fact that Many of these countries, in addition to the impact of international markets, a 23% increase, they were suffering major currency devaluations in their countries because of the rise in interest rates in the two centers in Europe and the US. Ethiopia that devaluated more than 100%. Well, 50% of the increase in prices, in food prices, came from the financial problem, not only from the international markets. And even when we were able to reduce this 23% almost completely during the year, the negotiation we had with Russia and Ukraine still had higher domestic prices, precisely because of the financial conditions they were facing. So what I would say, and you had all the energy subject that had an impact on domestic prices, because when the price of fertilizers and price of energy had an impact on the internal domestic prices of countries. So there was a UN joint capacity that in some way was able to include all the aspects that were having an impact on food insecurity. So I believe this was UN at its best, in its best phase. Coordination, consistency, dedication of many of the parties of the UN for this to be possible. Now, negotiation also, the proposal of the Secretary General, this was his proposal. I say this because I've seen so many things, presumably having been the authors of this agreement. So clearly we need to see that this was a proposal of the Secretary General who convinced in Russia and Ukraine, convinced Zelensky and Putin to have an agreement for a corridor of grain exports in the Black Sea. And it was signed in Istanbul in July of 2022. Two agreements were signed. Usually we speak about only one, but these were two corridors, one for Ukraine to be able to take out its food through the Black Sea, and 30 million tons of food come out, precisely in spite of the first moment of blockade suffered by Ukraine. Russia continued to export. Who was blocked was Ukraine in its maritime sea.
And they're exported through the Black Sea, and we're able to reduce prices of food for 10 months in a row. And with Russia, we signed MOU of the maritime corridor for grain was signed by Turkey, United Nations, and Russia. Russia and Ukraine don't have the same signature on the same document, although they are identical. The other one that was signed in Istanbul was the MOU between Russia and United Nations to guarantee that the exemption of the sanctions on Russia that were applicable to food and fertilizers would be real, that exception could be possible of materializing, and that is the MOU that I have to negotiate. We're still working on that. And the one of the Black Sea with Turkey is to be negotiated by Martin Griffith, and this has been one of the most interesting things that have happened to me in life. It's not easy, of course, but Of course, it's a major lesson learned. Thank you, Rebecca. And as we said at some point, you have three jobs to be the Secretary General of UNCTAD, to coordinate the Global Crisis Group, and also this negotiation. So it's quite intense. This makes me think now, which is, and for economists that are being trained according to Keynes of thinking of crisis by managing demand. And now we live in a world with all these disruptions in which managing a supply are key. All of this, what you are saying, are ways in which United Nations has helped to keep a supply of key products, energy, food, and I'm connecting this to another question from a colleague, KG Inwar, a very general question, but for sure there will be some important thoughts for you. Should United Nations and World Trade Organization to be restructured in the face of this polyglobalization? How do you envisage a new United Nations? I believe it's a building on this role that United Nations has played, in which it has played a significant role in this specific crisis, this world that not only of polyglobalization, but a polycrisis or permanent crisis. United Nations will have to develop these functions not only as this new situation, but maybe rethinking that is going to be a crisis management function, because the world will still have crisis one way or another. What are your thoughts on that? It's a very good question. The Secretary General has expressed openly that world governance needs to be reviewed. Of course, United Nations, the first discussion point is the Security Council, of course, and how to make the Security Council respond more to the reality of today and not to the reality of 1945. And that is a difficult discussion, and we have heard in the General Assembly several important countries that have a veto in the Security Council, P5, to say that they are willing to opening up a discussion on including other countries in the Security Council. However, for now, we have not seen any action in that regard. Countries become neutral because depending on who they decide to include in each region, you will always find a country that prevent the one proposed to be included from being included, and that has caused some paralysis, I guess. But undoubtedly, structures need to be more inclusive of the current reality, and that has not happened neither in the monetary fund or the World Bank or United Nations, especially in the Security Council. And that is the big governance battle into the future. As you know, the problem of capitalizing the World Bank, which is a proposal that we have supported, besides changing the model of the World Bank model, because I believe we need to change the working methods, and they are much more capable. But truly, as I said before, the World Bank is small compared to this huge task, so it needs to be capitalized. What has been the major issue for which an agreement has not been achieved in that capitalization, because the recapitalization of the World Bank also means reviewing what they call the alignment of the votes in the World Bank with regards to the weighting of the countries in the world economy. And in that sense, the uh, if that realignment take place, China would be the second one on board. It wouldn't be Japan anymore. And still, the United States would still have the majority of the vote. But of course, what it means both for the IMF and the World Bank is that they need a larger power of quota to China, besides other other countries that have significantly increased their importance in the world economy and that are not recognized in the systems of these two institutions. And this has been the biggest problem. So we are paralyzed in the sense of the need of a World Bank. Sometimes the Monetary Fund and the World Bank have been quite reactive of the criticism from UNCTAD and also the international financial systems. What I'm saying is what we are trying to do is to have an international financial architecture that is stronger and better. We need a better IMF and a stronger one, and we need a better and stronger World Bank. In the current situation, they cannot perform the task that the world needs. However, this depends on governance, of course. And the third item there's something from the Secretary General that I believe is very interesting, which is he is very active in the plurinational spaces of discussion in G20, G7, and BRICS. Instead of seeing them just as competition, to put it somehow, but he has seen it as space of influence for United Nations. And even he still keeps a relationship with all regional organizations, what he calls the network regionalism, realizing that you have this poly-globalization and poly-multilaterality, if you wish. So I believe the United Nations that's still the only legitimate element in terms of the representativeness, shouldn't marginalize all the other forms of concertation, if you wish, but it should try to have an influence in that more complex world that not only exists in the United States. So thank you. I'm aware of the time, but the conversation is so interesting. So we're going to keep on going for a few minutes, for those of you who can still be connected, because that last topic has to do with what you said, which is the idea that Daniel and we hope to have them next February have applied to democracy. Modern democracy is complex, but it needs even more complexity. And with that, you close your talk. A complex world, in order to govern it, it needs more complexity. And maybe a thought, it's not a question, unless you'd like to reflect on this as well. If we do not make progress in the short term in changing the governance of Bretton Woods institutions, there will be a scenario that has been already built that China, with its BRICS Bank and its own financing systems, not only through internet, but with a whole institutional arrangement for this global governance, would mean two sets of institutions. But I'd like to talk about something else, Rebecca. Uh, I don't see the name of the individual who asks the question. Another topic, starting from the African examples and others, what would be your recommendations for Latin America in order to tap into the minerals opportunities and to diversify economies? I'd just like to add something that we have discussed here at ECLAC, which is the topic of reprimarization. ECLAC and other institutions characterized in the context of Raúl Prebisch context is something negative. However, I see several countries in Latin America, starting by this one, Chile. When Chile has 12 of the strategic minerals, will be key in the revolution for electromobility in order to develop batteries. So the prices and quantities of manganese, lithium, and the whole list will grow. I believe I challenged colleagues to rethink it. Maybe it's not bad to go back to raw materials, but it depends on how it's done, what other types of diversification can happen. But what recommendations would you have to leverage the potential of minerals and to diversify economies? Well, I believe we are facing two a twofold challenge. The first part is something that we are also studying, is that in all this transition to renewable energies, in which these materials or raw materials become key, we've all thought that the transition to renewable energy will have a lower impact on climate change, will have positive impacts on climate change and the environment. But well, it depends on how we do mining. That is one of the things that we are studying now, and we need to consider because not any type of mining will have beneficial effects on the environment. And there's something that we need to go back to in the whole value chain. This is also happening with the digital world, that at first we saw this sublimation that the digital world had less carbon emissions, for example, but now we know that it's not the case, that all storage center or the mega data centers or storage centers have a huge energy consumption, and that energy, if it is not renewable, will have a specific effect. And there's also an effect on water. I didn't know it, at least myself, but the production of chips is quite water intensive, and it has very severe effects on water issues and also in sustainability in that regard. So there are several topics that must be analyzed in the value chain if we really want to achieve sustainable development. That would be worthwhile considering. And one of the main problems is what is the kind of contract negotiation for special raw materials. Because if there's no transparency and there are no good negotiations, we may end up in a very bad process of going back to raw materials. So I believe I don't see why we are not talking about whether to leverage or not those raw materials. But what we're saying is that if we can do more than just going back to them, and let alone with the level of development of our countries, what is the reason in order to settle for just mining lithium? I don't see a reason for that. That's the point. It's not mining this raw material, if we do it right or not, or sustainably with good contracts, which is the first step. But the issue is why not leveraging that moment so that the energy transition it also promotes productive diversification in our countries, even within the context of the energy value chain, and not only in other value chains. And the same topic is present in Africa. Africa should be able to with its negotiating power because of the concentration of minerals in its territory, which is the same case in South America, being able to negotiate in much better conditions in that value chain.
And technology transfer, finally, and investment. I see no reason why not to do both things. Totally in agreement. Yes, as we have said in ECLAC proposal, that there are 14 driving sectors, and the productive development policies should be of broad bandwidth. And one of the things, the incorporation of technical progress in this era of technology revolution and others. One thing, the most of the investment in renewable energies continues to go to developed countries. To Africa, only 3% goes. To those 1% to those least developed. So the investment that incorporates technical progress is not going to the countries of the South. And that is part of the problem. It's not only in adding markets but we are speaking of $3 trillion or $6 trillion in international market for the financing of sustainable development or green economy. Of those 6 trillions, most of it goes only to developed countries. And in Latin America, I must say, to emerging countries. And we are speaking of Brazil mainly. Brazil, that in 2022 had a tremendous boom of foreign direct investment, and to Mexico. It is a great concentration. Part of the problem is one of distribution. And if you don't leverage your negotiation power with the materials you have that everybody wants, it's going to be very difficult to attract quality investment, incorporating technical progress and conditions for productive diversification. And with this last, but I think there's no chance for any more questions. But once again, I come back to this subject that we were used to think that management of crisis, fiscal response, and aggregate demand. But everything we are speaking of is offer, supply. What's the geography of production? Where is production? Well, it depends on who has the minerals for certain things, but in other issues with the microchips, it's not the minerals. What incentives of industrial policies a country may have to have that industry or the other one, not to lose it, or not to industrialize in that field in particular. And that geography is very much, if production moves, employment moves. And also will depend on the education qualities, because these industries can move sometimes only where you have human talent to work in that industry. So that is very clear in your extraordinary presentation. Conceptually, it is a new way of thinking in this new phase of globalization. Here, we discuss geography of production, what determines it, how it moves, and in terms of development, how are you inserted in that world production geography, in this interdependent world, in a beneficial manner, and to be a win-win. So with this, we fully concur, fully in agreement, perfect agreement. Well, it has been an extraordinary lecture. Once again, a heartfelt applause to Rebeca Grynspan. And before we thank each other, reiterate your thanks for being here, for coming here, and for those who joined us online. And to Rebeca, thanks. After 4 years, you are the perfect person, the correct lecture for this world that has changed so very much in these 4 years. Thank you very much. Thank you, Executive Secretary of ECLAC, Mr. José Manuel Salazar. Thank you, Secretary General of UNCTAD, Mrs. Rebeca Grynspan. And those of you here, you're all invited to the hall. Thank you very much. Good afternoon.